Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session of LLF Online. My name is Asif Nawaz Shah, and I'm incredibly excited to be moderating this discussion with Professor Michael Greenstone, titled Our Energy, Our Future. To introduce Professor Greenstone, he is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, the College and the Harris School, as well as the Director of the Becker-Friedman Institute and the Interdisciplinary Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. He previously served as the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, directed the Hamilton Project, which studies policies to promote economic growth, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Econometric Society, and a former editor of the Journal of Political Economy. Prior to joining University of Chicago, Professor Greenstone was the 3M Professor of Environmental Economics at MIT. Professor Greenstone's research has influenced policymaking globally and is largely focused on uncovering the benefits and costs of environmental quality and energy choices available to society. His current work is particularly focused on testing innovative ways to increase energy access and improve the efficiency of environmental regulations around the world. Additionally, he is producing empirically grounded estimates of local and global impacts of climate change as a co-director of the Climate Impact Lab, and has also created the Air Quality Life Index that provides a measure of the gain in life expectancies communities around the world would experience if their particulates air pollution concentrations are brought into compliance with global and national standards. Welcome, Dr. Greenstone. It's a pleasure to be moderating this conversation, and thank you for taking out the time to join us for this LLF online session. With that, I'll hand over to you for your presentation, and then once that's done with, we'll enter the discussion portion of this session. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm sad that I cannot be in Lahore to do this in person, but I look forward to being able to visit Lahore and participate in a literary festival in the future once we have a vaccine. So let me try to share my screen. Okay. Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about what I like to call the global energy challenge. This challenge, I think, is really captured very well by this picture, actually from Pakistan, where what my view is that what societies are around the world are trying to do, countries, Pakistan, the United States, Russia, China, are to find a balance between three different goals. And together, I think that constitutes what I like to call the global energy challenge. That balance requires making sure that people have access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy. That's number one. And these inexpensive, reliable sources of energy power economic growth, allow people to ride motor scooters instead of walking, to drive instead of use motor scooters. So that's goal. Like, I think of it as a stool. That's leg one of the stool. Leg two of the stool is that a lot of the energy choices that we make and involve what economists call externalities. So that is the market, where we've constructed energy markets often leads to using fossil fuels, and those fossil fuels produce the very air pollution that you're seeing here in Pakistan. And that air pollution is not a secret to anyone. Its health impacts are not a secret. You can see these guys here in the picture have scarves to protect themselves from the air pollution. And then the third leg of the stool is that the same fossil fuels that are powering economic growth and advancement and causing air pollution, particulate air pollution, also involve the release of CO2. And although you can't see it here, that CO2 increases the odds of disruptive climate change. And so what societies have to figure out is a way to balance between those three goals. And it's not hard to think of solutions to any one of those goals, but they often come at the compromising one or two of the other goals. And so that's going to necessarily involve trade-offs, and that's going to involve how people value the future versus the present, and the health today versus health tomorrow, and incomes today versus health today. And it's a very complicated trade-off. But what I want to talk today is to try and illustrate that challenge in a little more detail, and then we'll have a discussion about this. So I like to think that there's 5 facts that kind of help govern the global energy challenge. And many of these facts, I think people instinctually know, but sometimes it's helpful to illustrate them. So the first is that energy is absolutely critical for growth. Here's just a plot of, on the horizontal axis, total energy consumption, on the vertical axis, GDP per capita. And what you can see is there's a very tight relationship between energy consumption and levels of economic activity. And we just don't have any examples of countries reaching high levels of GDP without using lots of energy. So that's kind of a starting point. We're going to need to use a lot of energy to achieve lifestyles that people around the world are interested in. The second is that energy access remains a major problem in many parts of the world. And here's just a couple countries that maybe help illustrate this. Here you can see per capita electricity consumption in, say, the United States is about 13,000 kilowatt hours per person annually. China is less than half of that at about 5,000. Mexico is maybe a sixth of that at 2,300. And Pakistan is at 600. So they're 20 times, more than 20 times, US energy consumption per person is more than 20 times greater. And that's not a feasible outcome for Pakistan. Pakistan has every intention of increasing that, and with very good reason. So energy access remains a major problem. One thing I want to point to, and reason I was happy to, one of the many reasons I was happy to participate in this, is that I think that part of the reason that this is such a big problem in Pakistan is the construction of electricity markets. And in many developing countries, electricity has kind of become a right, and people feel that they have a right to it. The problem is when electricity becomes a right, then no one feels like they have to pay for it. And the result of that is that all the discos lose money. And just think about trying to run a business where every time you sold a new bottle of Coca-Cola, you lost a little bit more money. The only way to solve that problem is to sell less Coca-Cola. And so, in fact, that's what the discos do. They try to sell less of their electricity, because every time they sell every extra unit, they lose more money. And the impact of that is that technical and commercial losses in Pakistan in the most recent year for which I had data account for about 25% of all power. So just think of that. Every time they sell $1 or $100 worth of electricity, they're only getting back $75. It's very difficult to do that. And the only solution to that really is to withhold supply. Now, of course, people come up with fancy names like load shedding, but at the end of the day, it just boils down to a decision to sell less, which is a very strange state of affairs for a normal market, which is suppliers often want to sell more. And what it highlights is that this social norm that electricity is a right really has this insidious effect of denying people access, who might be willing to pay for it, access to electricity. Here's just another way to illustrate some of the load shedding. Okay, so that's the second fact. The third is that demand in the coming decades is expected to grow rapidly in today's developing countries. That's not very surprising given what we've seen so far. And you can see, in fact, total energy consumption in the world is projected to grow by about a quarter between now and 2050. And all of that is in today's emerging markets, especially in Asia. So what will the world turn to for supplying that increase in energy? Well, although there have been lots of improvements in wind and solar, the IEA recently came out with a new report just yesterday, and that said by today, fossil fuels account for 80% of all energy. And yes, that will decline, but not by very much. It will only be down to 72% in 2040 if current policies continue to be pursued. So while renewables are the fastest growing resource, coal, oil, and natural gas together account for about half of all the growth through 2040. Now, why is it that we're choosing fossil fuels around the world? Well, the reason I'm going to come back to this is the way we construct energy markets. So let's just take a look at in the power sector. Now, these numbers are for the United States. I didn't have data to do this for Pakistan, but I think they're illustrative of what's going on around the world. You know, an existing coal plant can produce a kilowatt hour of electricity for about 3 cents US. A natural gas plant can do it for about 4 cents. Here you can see nuclear is about 9 cents. And so with these choices, you would end up, you know, it would be quite natural for people to choose coal and natural gas. And I'm going to talk about why this is largely a function of how we construct electricity markets, but it is how we do it. I'm just going to bring in now wind and solar. I'm going to bring them in with natural gas backup or and battery backup. So here's the natural gas backup, and this is just to fill in for the fact that they're intermittent resources. The sun doesn't shine all the time, and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And then if instead use batteries, it would be even more expensive. But the main point is that ignoring the external cost of coal looks like a really good deal. And so does natural gas, and that pushes us to rely on it. I'll just highlight, although there's been enormous improvements in the price of batteries for electric vehicles, really kind of amazing, down from about $1,200 per kilowatt hour in 2010 to $150 in 2019. There's still, electric vehicles are still pretty far out of the money compared to internal combustion engines, although that gap is closing. So in transport too, where markets are designed in such a way that people will continue to rely on fossil fuels. You know, some people used to talk about running out of fossil fuels. I think what's striking is that our ability to find them is actually growing more quickly than our use of them. You know, in 1980, there were only 30 years left of oil reserves. Now, and so that would have said that by 2010 we would have been out. But of course, now due to all the discoveries that the oil companies have made, there's actually like 50 years of consumption left. And so I think we're not going to run out of fossil fuels anytime soon. And the same is true for natural gas and coal as well. Okay, so energy is critical for growth. There's going to be a lot of growth in energy consumption. We're going to heavily rely on fossil fuels. Why is that? Why are we here to talk about that today? Well, we're here to talk about that today because fossil fuels have two nasty side effects that impose challenges on people's well-being. The first is fossil fuels increase pollution. That is kind of conventional air pollution. That's the pollution we could see in that picture that shortens lives. And so currently about 6 billion people around the world live in areas that exceed the WHO state guidelines for small particulate pollution. It is a major problem in Asia, as this chart shows. To help, so one concern I've had is that people, there's so much focus on climate change and people don't focus enough on, I think, on the harms and damages from conventional air pollution. And so I created something called the Air Quality Life Index. And it's a web-based tool. You can go to the web and find it. And it helps people see around the world what the consequences of air pollution are for them where they live. One thing that comes out of it is that particulate matter air pollution is the single greatest external threat to human health globally. The average person on the planet loses about 1.9 years of life expectancy due to particulate pollution. That's more than the average person loses to smoking or alcohol and drug use, road injuries, HIV/AIDS, anything. And so I think we can't, I think more attention should be paid to how damaging air pollution is. I thought it would be useful, given this talk is in Pakistan, to take a zoom in. One thing about the Air Quality Life Index is you can zoom into different parts of the world. And here you can zoom into Pakistan and you can see actually particulates pollution has worsened by about 20% since 1998 in Pakistan. All of Pakistan's people live in areas where pollution exceeds the WHO standards currently. If you then convert that into the loss in life expectancy, you can see that the average person in Pakistan is losing about 2.7 years of life expectancy. It's higher in Lahore, in Karachi, and some other places, and obviously some places below the average too. But this is happening now, and it's causing people to lead shorter and sicker lives. Okay, so the fifth fact that I think governs the global energy challenge that I wanted to talk about is that fossil fuels are causing climate change, and the consequences of that are complicated and really drive at the heart of what I think of as a global energy challenge. So let's take a look here. So I tried to get this data together. I had it on hand for India. I didn't have it on hand for Pakistan, and I apologize that I was not able to get the Pakistan data, but this is the distribution of daily average temperatures in India. You would read this as and this is in degrees Fahrenheit, the typical person in India, and Pakistan has a similar climate, not the same climate, faces 60 days a year where temperatures are between 79 and 81 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the current temperature distribution. What is projected to happen at the end of the century? Well, you can see there's this big piling up of days at the very high temperatures. And the reason I want to emphasize that is that's where the damages, the really nasty damages from climate change occur. This is where crops fail. This is where there's stress put on human health. This is where it becomes unpleasant, bordering on impossible to work outdoors, and on and on and on. So let's just take a look at what the research says the consequences of more days in this range would be. To do that, I'm going to borrow from two papers of mine. One looks at India and one looks at the world. Or India, I was able to get some data. So let's just, the India one begins with a comparison of the United States and India. And the way to read this is, I'm going to treat 70 to 74 as kind of a base day. And then ask, well, what happens if I swap a day from 70 to 74 to any of these other temperature ranges? And the point I want you to take is that and this is in the United States, the very high temperatures, there is some increase in the annual mortality rate if you change the day from 70 to 74 to these higher temperatures. But just notice the y-axis here. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to stretch it out, and you'll see why in a minute. And so although there's this upward slope, when you stretch it out, the upward slope is still there, but when you stretch it out, it's barely visible. And that's like saying, oh, well, maybe there's not such a big effect on animal mortality. Now, why did I stretch it out? Well, because I want to put the same response function for India on the same axis. And when you do that, what you can see is there's this dramatic effect of hot days on annual mortality rates in India. So every additional day that India swaps from 70 to 74 to say greater than 95 increases the annual mortality rate by almost a percentage point. And remember, with climate change, India is going to get many, many more of those days. And this is where I think, like the global energy challenge, it really starts to bind. You can see that the blue line is where people want to be. They're basically protected from the ravages of temperature change and from high temperatures. The red line is a very, very challenging place to be. That's where when a hot day comes, you get extra death. I mean, here, really, along with that, of course, there's sickness and, sicker and shorter lives. And if you're India or if you're Pakistan or another emerging economy, it's not acceptable to be on the red line. You really want to be on the blue line. And what's the best way to get to the blue line? Well, that's all that energy consumption we were looking at the beginning of my talk. And you want to get there as inexpensively as possible. And that pushes towards using these fossil fuels, which, if you ignore their external costs, really are much less expensive. So now let's zoom out from India and the United States and look at the world. Here are some projections of what's going to happen around the world in 2100 with climate change. And you can see actually there's lots of regions in the world where mortality risk will go down because these places are going to get rid of the very cold winter days that impose risk. But there are places that are already hot and are currently emerging economically. You can see there's going to be lots of increase in mortality. Delhi will have a very large increase in mortality risk. I'm going to zoom in on Pakistan in a second. And you can see that there's very disparate impacts. Accra is going to have very large. Oslo is interesting. It's going to have a very large decrease. And there's really heterogeneous impacts around the world. Here's the case of Pakistan. Pakistan, because of the existing climate and income levels, is projected to experience very large increases in mortality risk by the end of the century. It underscores the need for economic growth in Pakistan and for developing adaptation strategies. So let's now get a little bit further in pointing to the trade-offs. So if we're going to avoid this, it's going to be critical that there's a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions around the planet. Now, where could that come from? Well, today, the United States accounts for about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. Other developed countries account for, say, 25%. Today's developing countries account for 60%. So just like the raw, painful algebra is, if you want to get a reduction, a lot of it's going to happen in today's developing countries, and those are the very places that need more energy consumption. And indeed, if you project out to 2050, by 2050, today's developing countries are projected to account for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and by the end of the century, maybe 73%. So this is where the global energy challenge really binds, which is that the very places that are most in need of increased energy are also most exposed to climate change. And if the world is going to avoid disruptive climate change, there have to be reductions from these countries. And that's not saying who's going to pay for it, but just the planet doesn't really care if the emissions came from the United States or the developed countries or developing countries. The planet only cares that there's emissions. I'll just point out what it would require to stay below. We already have a degree of sea of warming. What would it require to stay below 2 degrees is really dramatic, and would envision very sharp reductions that are, the world is nowhere near a path to make. Okay, so I know I'm probably over time. Let me just try and wrap up quickly. I think there's probably 3 key solutions that I think are worth consideration, particularly in the Pakistan context. So the first is, and I'll come back to this, part of the reason we're leaning towards choosing fossil fuels or choose fossil fuels is they look so inexpensive, but they only look inexpensive when one ignores their external costs. And so what I've done here is I've added in the green bar the impacts of greenhouse gases, that's the green bar, from using coal, the damages, and then the impacts of health from air pollution. And when you do that, and this is the United States case, when you do that, you can see that what looked like a great deal for coal, now nobody in their right mind would buy coal or would use coal. The cost, once you account for these external costs, it makes coal look like a terrible deal. It makes natural gas look like a winner. It also makes the renewables very close to being in the money. And maybe with continued innovation, they would be. And of course, the exact numbers will vary depending on context to context or country to country. And Pakistan is obviously a great place for solar. Okay, so number 1 policy recognition is price energy is at its full cost. Number 2 is policy often does not produce the results we had hoped or thought it would. And so I think it's critical to conduct policy reforms to use experiments to evaluate policy reforms. This has become more and more popular globally. At the heart, this is just using a randomized control trial where you randomly assign to test these ideas, some people to the treatment group and some to the comparison group. In Pakistan, there are really tremendous opportunities to do that on the revolve around repairing electricity markets to solve this problem that we talked about at the beginning, where people face, really untenable degrees of load shedding. There are also opportunities to do that around air pollution, public disclosure emissions, using market-based enforcement techniques, et cetera. So there's many, many opportunities, and these could be done in Pakistan. And I know the Prime Minister has been a strong proponent of this. Finally, the last thing is we're just not investing as a world, as the planet, enough in energy R&D to get the cost of fossil fuels, to get the cost of clean energy to be more competitive, and the world should be doing more of that. So let me end with where I began. I think the global energy challenge really is a stool that has three legs, and all countries and societies around the world have to find ways to balance the goals of inexpensive and reliable energy with air that people can breathe, and avoiding disruptive climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Greenstone. That was incredibly informative. And thank you for sharing that with us. So before we move into
Asif, I think you're on mute. I'm not able to hear you.
Am I still on mute? Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. I just said thank you for your, I feel like there's an echo coming in, sorry. Thank you for your presentation. It was incredibly informative. And before we move on to any questions we've gotten from the audience at the live, let's dig in a bit to some of the things that you brought out in the presentation. So I think if I may start at the point of the first leg of the global energy challenge, which is reliable, affordable, accessible energy. Like you said, the International Energy Agency just came out with their 2020 World Energy Outlook, which for the first time pretty much actually gave solar a chance, essentially, and demonstrates that by 2040, solar, rather than previously thought, is actually 50 to 50% cheaper and will account for 43% of the increase in global energy. Keeping that in mind, what is the opportunity there then for countries like Pakistan, who receive a high incidence of solar radiation, other countries in the developing world, to use solar technologies and develop that capacity to drive down the cost of renewables and reduce their reliance on fossil fuels?
Yeah, so I think that's a terrific question. I think the advances in solar they would not have been predictable 5 and certainly 10 years ago. And we are beginning to see that in favorable locations, solar can really compete with the fossil fuels. Pakistan, I think, as you said, due to the amount of solar radiation it gets, is very well positioned. And I think a challenge is, while installing more solar, you are increasing more intermittency. And a lot of the costs of renewables are kind of the indirect costs. So those cost numbers that you cite, I think, do not account for the indirect costs that get socialized onto the grid. And it's very important that there continue to be advances in trying to find ways to reduce some of those indirect costs. So those indirect costs are often the intermittency. I don't know that this is the case in Pakistan, but in the United States, where solar and wind is most available, is often very far from city centers. And so that requires lots of transmission. And so I think there'll need to be a lot of experimentation on how to manage the integration of renewables into the grid. But it is absolutely It's absolutely a plus that the advances in solar and wind, and pairing that with advances in batteries will be very important.
Right. Um, Thank you. And just to follow up on that, um, when it comes to things like battery technology, what are the and other parts of the renewable energy value chain, whether that's building batteries, producing solar equipment and parts, other enabling technologies, resource extraction, especially for battery production, lithium extraction also has an immense impact on the environment. So what are the barriers, whether they're organizational, institutional, political, technological, and how can countries that maybe don't have the head start that the United States or large parts of the European Union do, how can those countries leapfrog their transitions?
Yeah, so I guess uh, uh, so. One thing that I think I'll come to is there's a very unlevel playing field for right now in the energy sector, and that is that the fossil fuel plants get to pollute for free. They get to create this terrible air pollution that is, shortening the life of the average person in Pakistan by almost 3 years. Uh, and that really penalizes the renewables. And so I would actually point to leveling the playing field by having a tax on particulate matter emissions or on SOx or NOx that turn into particulates as a way of kind of leveling the playing field. Because it's not that people in Pakistan, anywhere around the world, are not paying that price currently. They're just paying it. It's just that the fossil fuel companies get to do it, providers get to do it for free, impose that on everyone. So that's one. I think, and then I think opportunistically, Pakistan should be looking for opportunities to find inexpensive locations to install solar and wind and take advantage of it, no doubt. I'm not sure that, you know, whether it makes sense for Pakistan to devote lots of resources to advancing the R&D of some of these technologies. Like, maybe some of the universities will because there's excellent scientists there. But I think the first order issue is creating a level playing field when it comes to energy, and there is not one
Understood. Thank you. And so transitioning on to the second leg, which is reliance on fossil fuels and the impacts that we get from that. One of the major ones that you touched upon was air pollution. Um, so given the environmental and health impact of our energy systems, what, in terms of mitigating air pollution, I think you alluded to this in your presentation, what are some realistic but progressive policy goals for a country like Pakistan and indeed countries around the region? You've done some work with India so as well. So what are some of those realistic progressive policy goals we can set in terms of greening our grid and addressing
currently. Yeah.
the public health challenge?
So I think, sorry, you're going in now, but I think your question is, what could Pakistan do about the air pollution problem? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not that dissimilar to my last question. One thing that Pakistan could do is stop letting it be a free ride for producers of particulates pollution. Right now, it's basically, it's barely penalized, and there should be very clear rules and regulations about that. I think the best way to do that would be to set up a cap and trade market for, say, SOx or NOx. Those exist in the United States. I recently have been working with the state of Gujarat in India, and we've run a pilot that has an emissions trading system for SOx. For PM. And that has been very effective. In fact, the polluters have all liked it because they find it much less onerous than the current form of regulation. It allows for kind of a win-win where you can reduce air pollution and reduce the cost of compliance.
Got it. So investing in an emissions trading cap and trade market.
Yes.
Got it.
Um,
Sorry,
no,
please go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to move on and touch on to
Oh,
talk
yeah, sorry, let me interrupt you for 1 second. Another way to do it, of course, would just be to have a tax. And that was kind of either cap and trade or a tax is exactly what I have in mind. And like, maybe it's worth, why don't we take, if I could share screen again for 1 second.
Yes.
I think it's maybe useful to look at this. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so if we just look at this slide, what you can see that is really interesting is when there is no regulation or no penalty for applying for polluting, coal looks like a great deal. It costs 2.9 cents per kilowatt hour. Natural gas is 4.2 cents. Nuclear is like 9 cents. I know in Pakistan, actually, the prices are higher because Pakistan is saddled with some of these long-term contracts with suppliers. But the point I want to make is, well, what if that playing field wasn't level anymore and the guys who are producing the air pollution and the CO2 actually had to pay the damages associated with that? And then the price of coal goes from 2.9 cents to 18 cents. Now, these numbers are for the United States, but they're going to be comparable for Pakistan. And what that is trying to say is nobody would buy coal when you could buy natural gas. It just doesn't make any sense. Because you're now paying 18 cents and you could have been, you could be paying 8 cents. And so that's really what I'm talking about when I say, let's level the playing field.
Reflect the social price of these energy sources.
Yeah.
So just a quick follow-up on that point. When it comes to reflecting social costs of energy sources in the way they're priced, should we be looking at pricing renewable energy or more environmentally friendly sources of energy in a similar way, wherein we reflect the social benefit derived from those energy sources? Is that one way that we could potentially make renewables and other energy sources more competitive?
Yeah, I mean, one could subsidize the renewables, and a lot of countries do that. I think the more it becomes a little bit complicated how to calculate that. I think the more straightforward way to do it is to penalize the guys who are creating the pollution. But whatever it is, you got to level the playing field. Right now, renewables have to compete with one hand tied behind their back.
Right. And then coming to the last question I have before we move on to audience questions. And this kind of touches upon the bridge between climate change and air pollution, and what you just said, that renewables already face an unlevel playing field. When it comes to the problem of climate change, that will present even more challenges for countries like Pakistan, as you pointed out, to develop their clean energy capacities. So Pakistan, a country which has a high ecological and human vulnerability, relatively low abatement costs in terms of transitioning from infrastructure, traditional energy infrastructure to renewables. Um, how can Pakistan invest in building resilience within its energy system, not just enhancing the generation capacity, but building the resilience of its infrastructure and energy systems to hazards like extreme heat or flooding and sea level rise, etc.?
Yeah. So look, Pakistan is not well positioned geographically for climate change. And I would think that even before, I mean, so obviously there's got to be resilience built into the infrastructure system, but I think it's increasingly becoming clear that there has to be resilience built into protecting people, today, really, from the high temperatures and the increasingly high temperatures. And part of that is going to, there's a variety, honestly, fixing the electricity system that we talked about at the beginning, where there's not so much load shedding, and electricity is treated as a private good, will allow people to invest in cooling. And that's, the advent of air conditioning in the United States, so my own research has shown, was an enormous life preserver for people. And it made parts of the United States that were probably largely uninhabitable become habitable. And I think to do that in Pakistan, the first step is to get the electricity markets functioning correctly. And I think that is going to require moving away from the idea that electricity is a right that people don't have to pay for, and really setting up those as markets for like regular goods, like buying a phone or buying food, or where people have to pay for what they get. Now, that's not to say that there can't be redistribution for the poor. Of course, there should be, but it should not be done through the electricity system. So I think fixing up the electricity system is really absolutely urgent for helping Pakistan grow, but also make itself resilient to the very high temperatures that climate change is producing.
Great. And within strengthening and fixing the electricity system, do you think off-grid solutions have as much of a role to play as the grid itself?
I think they can be an important part of it. Getting the pricing right for their participation with the grid is complicated. It's something that we've had a difficult time doing well in the United States. But if I could come away with a few big themes. One, air pollution is a bigger problem for Pakistan today than I think is widely appreciated or recognized, and it's causing people to lead shorter and sicker lives. Two, the social norm that electricity is a right it's hard to disagree with when you first hear it, but what my research has found is that it has these very perverse and insidious effects. And that perverse effect really boils down to the desire to give people electricity prevents people from having the electricity they need, because it leads to this system of non-payment. And then the discos really have no choice but to restrict supply. Now, I don't think that's an immutable law of physics. I think that is a market outcome, and that can be fixed. And I think there are several good ideas out there on how to do it. They need to be tested with randomized control trials, like I talked about, in the Pakistan context. But it is, I believe, with proper testing, a solution could be within reach, not within 5 or 10 years, but within a year or two. It would require real commitment, and I know the Prime Minister has been very focused on that.
Right. So it is within reach, and we can get there. That's great. I think now we've gotten a couple of questions in from our audience, so I'm just gonna jump into those. The first one is, what is the potential for wave power in a country like Pakistan? We have a very long coastline, and the Arabian Sea is one of the most energetic bodies of water in the world. Professor Greenstone.
Yes, I think it's important to know when you're over your head, and I am over my head when it comes to waves. And I only know, I don't think wave technology for producing electricity is commercial anywhere in the world. And so I suspect that will require a lot more innovation before it can really produce electricity that people would be willing to pay for.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be doing that research and looking for opportunities. But I think it's probably not a short-term solution.
Got it. That's real blue sky solutions.
Yeah.
Second question coming in is, our Science and Technology Ministry is big on bypassing the electricity grid and mainstreaming lithium batteries to produce power at the household level. What are your thoughts on the feasibility and efficacy of this solution?
I suspect what the ministry is focused on is that there are parts, Pakistan, all countries have remote parts where it can be especially difficult to deliver, expensive to deliver electricity. And with the reduction in costs in batteries and the reduction in costs of solar, I think there are increasing opportunities for delivering electricity through mini grids, solar mini grids that use batteries. I've done a lot of work on this, and the underlying cost structures are changing so quickly that makes it a little complicated, but to generalize. But one strong takeaway is that there can definitely be a role for off-grid solar, but people really love the grid. And they love the grid because of its reliability. They love the grid because a lot of off-grid solar, although not all, a lot of off-grid solar mini grids can't power the kinds of appliances that they would like, TVs, refrigerators, even air conditioners. And so it's not a bad stopgap, and it's increasingly able to offer more, but I think people love the grid, and there's a good reason for it.
Right. Maximum service delivery.
Yeah. And it's still, even though off-grid solar has become less expensive, it's still more efficient to have utility scale solar.
Right. Great. So the last question touches upon the social cost of fossil fuels and air pollution. The question reads, you've shared some pretty powerful figures regarding reduction in life expectancy. However, you still see things working a certain way in countries like ours. We still measure economic progress with indicators like sale of cars and motorcycles. It's obvious how this is at odds with environmental and health indicators. So what should governments be doing to measure economic progress in a more environmentally aware way?
Okay, so look, I think this is a very deep question that has been asked here. And it strikes at why I think we don't have a climate challenge. I don't think we have an air pollution challenge. I don't think we have an energy challenge or electricity challenge. We have a global energy challenge, which is the combination of all of these. And of course, Pakistan wants to have higher levels of income that allow more people to have cars and allow more people to have motorcycles. And every country is going to have to find the right way to trade off those goals. I think what I want to communicate today and more broadly is that the magnitudes and the nature of those trade-offs. And what should be clear is continued reliance on fossil fuels for cheap electricity might be good for advancing economic growth, but not so good for with respect to air pollution, and that has real consequences for people's lives. It really causes them to lead much shorter and sicker lives. I should add, it's a little speculative, but I have some new research, and there's been some research by others, that particulate air pollution exposure for at very young ages can actually lead to people getting less years of education and earning less as adults. So there can really be long run consequences from it. So the trade-offs are very real. I think, I would recommend is it's sometimes easier to ignore those trade-offs, but keeping those trade-offs front of mind, I think, is very important in devising policy.
Got it. Excellent. I think that covers all the questions we've received from our audience. I want to thank you again, Professor Greenstone, for taking the time out to join us today. It was a very instructive and informative session. I know I learned a lot myself, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I know I did. So with that, unless Professor Greenstone, you'd like to say anything else, I will wrap the session up and thank everyone for their time.
That sounds great. Thank you. It's a great honor to be able to participate in this, and I hope one day to be able to participate in the Lahore Literary Festival in person.
Definitely. We look forward to that. Thank you so much, Professor Greenstone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, LLF.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.